The morning Patricia Wells discovered that the driveway she had been using as a turnaround for 2 years had acquired an 18-inch concrete barrier across its entrance overnight. I was on a ferry crossing the Strait of Georgia toward Vancouver Island with my wife Ellen, a thermos of coffee between us, the Pacific Northwest fog sitting low on the water, and my phone showing me the camera feed from 1,400 miles away in real time, because I had installed the cameras 11 days earlier specifically for this occasion, and had confirmed they were saving correctly to the cloud before I put our bags in the car and drove to the airport. My name is Garrett Walsh. I am 53 years old, a licensed structural engineer and concrete contractor with 24 years of experience in residential and commercial foundation and hardscape work, and I have lived in the Maple Crest HOA development in eastern Washington state for 6 years. Ellen teaches middle school science. Our house is a 4-bedroom craftsman on a corner lot with a single-car detached garage accessed by a concrete driveway that runs from Sycamore Street along the southern edge of our lot to the garage, 49 feet long, 11 feet wide, finished with an exposed aggregate surface that I had poured and finished myself 3 years ago because I am a concrete contractor, and I do not pay someone else to do concrete work on my own property when I can do it correctly myself. Patricia Wells had lived 2 houses north on Sycamore Street for 4 years, 2 years longer than I had. She drove a Ford Explorer in a shade of gray. I had never heard her name, and she had been using my driveway as a turnaround since approximately my 5th month in the house, when I had first noticed the tire marks in the exposed aggregate surface that were not consistent with my own vehicle's track width. I had confirmed the pattern through a doorbell camera installation in month 6 and had begun my documentation that same week. I will not walk you through the full 18 months of behavioral solutions in detail, because if you have read any of the prior accounts in this collection, you already know the shape of the sequence. Direct conversations, written notes, HOA complaints, fines that were paid and ignored, attorney letters that produced phone calls describing the letters as disproportionate. What I will tell you is that by month 18, I had 53 documented incidents across 14 months of camera-documented use after the initial confirmation, 6 formal interactions with Patricia, 2 HOA complaints, 1 fine, and 1 attorney letter from my property lawyer Karen Aldrich. And that Patricia had said some version of "I understand" and will stop on 6 separate occasions, and had demonstrated through continued behavior that understanding and stopping were not the same thing for her. I want to tell you specifically about the last conversation because it shaped the approach I took. The last conversation was on a Tuesday evening in March. Patricia had called me after receiving Karen's letter. She was not warm in the way she had been in the first 5 conversations. She was measured in the specific way of someone who has decided that the situation has become adversarial and is choosing her words accordingly. She said she found the attorney letter disproportionate, which was a word I had heard before in this context. She said she had been using the driveway since before I moved in and that the previous owner had not objected. She said she hoped I would reconsider my approach because she found the escalation of a minor convenience matter into a legal dispute unfriendly and unnecessary. I said, "Patricia, I have spoken to you 5 times about this. I have left 2 written notes. I have filed 2 HOA complaints. I have a documented record of 53 incidents. The attorney letter is not an escalation. It is the current step in a sequence that started 18 months ago when I asked you to stop the first time." She said, "I am asking you to be reasonable." I said, "I have been reasonable for 18 months. I have given you every opportunity to address this through conversation. The structural solution I am planning is also reasonable. It is a physical fact on my own property, and it will resolve the situation permanently." She said, "What structural solution?" I said, "I am going to install a concrete barrier across the entrance to my driveway." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A concrete barrier?" I said, "Yes, I am a concrete contractor. It is within my capability and my legal rights. The barrier will prevent use of my driveway as a turnaround because the entrance will not be passable." She said, "You cannot do that. you need your driveway. I said, the barrier will be designed to allow my access. It will prevent the turnaround maneuver specifically. She said, how? I said, that is a technical question I am happy to answer. The barrier will be an 18-inch concrete curb across the entrance at the curb cut, continuous across the full width, except for a 42-inch vehicle entry notch on the western side, aligned with my garage approach line. A vehicle entering my driveway can pass through the notch on the correct approach angle. A vehicle attempting to reverse into the driveway from the street, which is the turnaround maneuver you use, will contact the barrier before it can enter. She was quiet for a longer moment. She said, you designed that specifically for my turnaround. I said, I designed a driveway access control feature that serves my legitimate property interests. The effect on unauthorized turnaround attempts is a consequence of serving those interests. She said, you have thought about this carefully. I said, I have thought about it for several months. Good night, Patricia. I ended the call. The concrete barrier design had been in my head since month 12, when I had begun planning the structural solution in parallel with the behavioral sequence I was still working through. I had the luxury of designing my own solution rather than hiring it done, which meant I could be precise about the geometry in a way that a non-engineer might not prioritize. The notch alignment was the critical element. I needed it positioned so that my vehicle, a Toyota Tundra with a specific wheel track and approach angle to the garage, could enter cleanly at its normal approach without the barrier affecting my use at all. The notch had to be wide enough for my truck, narrow enough that the Explorer could not pass through at the reverse approach angle Patricia used, and positioned at the exact alignment required for my truck's approach. I spent an evening measuring and calculating. The Tundra has a track width of 66 inches. The Explorer has a track width of 67.3 inches. The difference is 1.3 inches. That difference, combined with the approach angle geometry, meant that a 42-inch notch, aligned precisely with my garage approach line, would allow my truck to enter at its normal approach angle and would position the Explorer's rear wheels against the barrier when Patricia attempted her reverse entry turnaround maneuver. 1.3 inches of difference and an angle calculation. That was the engineering margin I was working with. I verified the calculation 3 times with different assumptions about approach angle variation. The geometry held in all cases. The notch position worked. I pulled the permit for a driveway modification 2 weeks after the phone call. My municipality required a permit for permanent concrete structures at the curb cut. I submitted the drawings with the barrier dimensions and the notch specifications. The permit was issued in 12 days. Ellen and I had been planning the Vancouver Island trip since January. We had a specific itinerary: Victoria for 3 days, Tofino for 4, Campbell River for 3, and a final 2 days back in Victoria. We had wanted to make this trip for years and had deferred it twice. I had told Ellen in February that this was the year and that I intended to pour the barrier the week before we left so the concrete would have full cure time before we returned. The barrier went in on a Saturday 11 days before our departure. I poured it myself, which is what you do when you are a concrete contractor and the work is on your own property. The mixed design was standard residential 4000 psi with fiber reinforcement for crack resistance. I set the forms on Friday evening, mixed and poured on Saturday morning, finished the exposed aggregate surface to match my existing driveway, and pulled the forms Saturday afternoon. By Sunday morning, the concrete had reached initial set. By the time Ellen and I drove to the airport 11 days later, it had full cure strength, which for 4000 psi concrete in the temperature conditions we had that week was essentially complete at 28 days, but functionally complete at 7. I had installed 4 cameras in the week before departure, 2 at the driveway entrance covering the barrier and the street approach from both directions, 1 covering the side of the house from a position that captured the full driveway length, 1 at the garage end looking back toward the street. The system was cloud-based, motion-activated, time-stamped, and had been tested on 3 consecutive days before we left to confirm reliable operation. We flew to Seattle, took the ferry to Victoria, and began the trip I had been planning for 2 years. The first alert came on day 2. Patricia's Explorer at my driveway entrance at 7:51 in the morning. The camera showed the approach, the reverse maneuver she had been using for 2 years, and the moment the Explorer's rear left wheel contacted the eastern section of the barrier approximately 14 inches from the notch edge. She sat in the Explorer for 30 seconds. Then she pulled forward and drove north on Sycamore Street. I watched this from a hotel room in Victoria with a cup of coffee and the harbor visible through the window. I noted the timestamp and the outcome in my documentation log and closed the app and went to find Ellen for breakfast. She was in the hotel restaurant reading a book. She looked up when I sat down. She said, "The camera." I said, "First contact. The barrier worked as designed." She said she hit the barrier. I said her rear wheel contacted the barrier section at the correct position. She pulled forward and left. Ellen said, "How far from the notch?" I said, 14 inches. She said, "You designed that margin." I said, "The notch alignment is calibrated to my truck's approach angle. Her reverse approach angle hits the barrier 14 inches from the notch edge because that is what the geometry produces." She said, "You calculated that." I said, "I verified it 3 times." She went back to her book. I ordered breakfast and we ate looking at the Victoria Harbour, and I did not think about Patricia Wells or the barrier or the documentation folder for the rest of the morning. The alerts over the first week came with a pattern I found instructive. Day 2, first contact, 30-second pause, departure. Day 3, second contact, 45-second pause, departure. Day 4, no contact. Day 5, contact from a slightly different approach angle that I analyzed on my phone in Tofino while Ellen was taking photographs of the coast, confirming that Patricia was attempting to find an approach angle that would allow the Explorer to pass the barrier. The geometry did not accommodate her search because the barrier section extended the full width of the entrance except for the notch, and the notch alignment was incompatible with her approach angle regardless of variation within the range available from Sycamore Street. Day 6, no contact. Day 7, contact at the standard approach angle, longest pause yet at 4 minutes and 12 seconds, then departure. Day 8 through 11, no contact. On day 12, the second day in Campbell River, my phone showed an alert that was different from the prior contacts. The camera showed not just Patricia's Explorer, but Patricia standing beside the Explorer examining the barrier from the sidewalk. She had gotten out of her vehicle and was looking at the barrier closely for the first time. She walked the full width of the barrier, examined the notch, examined the barrier section on both sides of the notch, and crouched down to look at the base where the concrete met the existing driveway surface. She stood up and looked at the house for a moment. Then she looked at the camera above the garage door that was pointing toward the street. She appeared to register its presence for the first time. She looked at the camera for 3 seconds. Then she got back in the Explorer and drove away. I forwarded the footage to Karen Aldrich with a note that Patricia had inspected the barrier and appeared to have located the cameras. Karen acknowledged receipt and said she would update the civil claim documentation. The civil claim had been filed the day before Ellen and I left for the airport. Karen had been building it since month 16 of the documented sequence and had filed it after the phone call in which I had described my structural solution plans, which she had noted was appropriate timing because it put Patricia on formal notice of the impending installation before it was in place, which was legally cleaner than a surprise installation. The claim covered 53 documented incidents across 14 months, the paid fine that acknowledged the violation, the attorney letter and Patricia's response characterizing it as disproportionate, the permit and installation costs for the barrier, the camera system installation costs, Karen's fees, and compensatory damages for the sustained pattern of unauthorized use. Patricia retained an attorney named Philip Howell, who called Karen the day we returned from Vancouver Island. He had reviewed the claim and the documentation, and his opening position was that the barrier constituted an intentional interference with Patricia's established use pattern of the driveway approach. Karen said, Your client does not have an established use pattern on my client's private property. She has a documented history of unauthorized use that my client has spent 18 months asking her to stop. Philip said the barrier was designed specifically to affect her vehicle. Karen sent him my engineering analysis. The analysis explained the notch alignment calculation, the turning radius geometry, the track width differential, and the approach angle mathematics. It established that the notch was designed for my truck's specific approach requirements, and that the barrier section's effect on Patricia's turnaround maneuver was a consequence of the geometry required to serve my legitimate access needs. Philip called Karen after reviewing the analysis. Karen told me afterward that he had been quiet for a moment and had then said, "Your client calculated the track width differential." Karen said, "To 1.3 inches. The calculation is in the analysis." Philip said, "She did this as an engineer, not as someone trying to block a neighbor." Karen said she did it as an engineer who owns a private driveway and has the technical knowledge to design a legitimate access control feature that serves her property interests. The effect on your client's turnaround is a byproduct of the geometry, not the purpose of the design. Philip said, "I need to discuss this with my client." The settlement negotiation took 2 weeks. The final number was $13,800. Patricia paid it personally. Her homeowner's insurance declined coverage because the sustained intentional conduct fell outside accidental occurrence provisions. Howard Park, the retired architect, did not make an appearance in this story because Howard Park lived in Sycamore Hill in Virginia and I live in Eastern Washington. But my equivalent neighbor, a retired civil engineer named Bernard Chu, came over the Saturday after the settlement and stood at the end of my driveway looking at the barrier. He said, "The notch." I said, 42 inches, aligned with my truck's approach angle. He said, "That is a narrow notch." I said, "My truck clears it by 12 inches on each side at normal approach, adequate clearance for my use." He said, "And the Explorer?" I said, "Contacts the barrier 14 inches from the notch edge at her approach angle." He said, "You measured her approach angle?" I said, "I observed it from camera footage over 14 months. Consistent angle within about 3 degrees of variation." He said, "You designed for 3 degrees of variation." I said, "I verified the geometry holds for plus or minus 5 degrees of approach angle variation. Conservative margin." Bernard looked at the barrier for a moment. He was a civil engineer, and he was reading the work the way engineers read work, looking at dimensions and finishes and connections, and asking the questions that the geometry suggested. He said, "The exposed aggregate matches the existing surface." I said, "Same mix design, same aggregate source, same finishing technique." He said, "You matched it deliberately." I said, "I am a concrete contractor. Matching is what you do when you are working adjacent to existing work." He said, "The barrier looks like it was always there." I said, "It was designed to look correct. Correct things look like they belong." He said, "The notch is the only indication it was added later." I said, "The notch is the functional element. Everything else is aesthetic." He said, "The functional element serves your access. The aesthetic element serves the property." I said, "Yes." He looked at it for another moment. He said, 2 years she used this driveway." I said, 14 months documented. The prior period before the camera was installed, estimated at 6 months based on the wear pattern I noticed, makes approximately 20 months total. He said, 20 months of turnarounds. I said, 53 documented incidents after the camera went in. He said, "And now?" I said, "She uses the cul-de-sac 200 feet east on Sycamore Street." He said, 200 feet. I said, "Which was always available." He nodded. He went home. I went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table looking out the south window at the exposed aggregate driveway with the barrier at the entrance and the notch aligned with my truck's approach line and the afternoon light coming across the surface, the way it always did in eastern Washington in the spring, flat and golden, catching the aggregate texture and making it look like something that had been there for a long time. It had been there for 3 months. It would be there for 30 years if I maintained it correctly, which I would, because I was a concrete contractor and I maintained my work. Ellen came in from the backyard and said, "The barrier." I said, "Bernard came by." She said, "Did he notice the notch alignment?" I said, "First thing he looked at." She said, "Engineers always notice the design intent." I said, "The intent is in the geometry. If you know what you are looking at, you can read it." She said, "What did he say?" I said, "He said the functional element serves my access and the aesthetic element serves the property." She said, "He summarized it well." I said, "He is a civil engineer. He read it correctly." She made tea and sat across from me, and we were quiet for a moment in the specific way of people who have resolved something that needed resolving and are now in the ordinary day that the resolution restored. The driveway was mine. It had always been mine. It was mine in exactly the way it had been on the day I poured the exposed aggregate surface 3 years ago, working with materials I knew and finishing to a standard I held for all my work. The barrier was mine too now. Correct specification, correct finish, correct geometry, calibrated to within 1.3 inches of the dimensional difference that made it work. That was the standard. It had always been the standard. It was sufficient. It was always sufficient when you applied it correctly. Thumbnail text, she used his driveway 50+ times. A concrete contractor designed a barrier calibrated to 1.3 inches. She never got in again.